Check, 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 check. Testing. Check, check, check. Check, check, check. Check, check, check. 1, 2. Check, 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 check. Oh, yeah, I was. Sure, sure. Cool. Oh, I didn't know there was a video. Yeah, totally.
Just to get everybody ready. It's this
Yeah,
one.
sure.
It's on. Am I on? I just want to make sure. I think I screwed up a slide
Okay.
today. Can I get a? I'm not
You
on.
want it on screen?
Okay, good. Thanks.
No, you
I don't want to
it
be on screen.
Okay. And then as far as a mic goes, is this okay, a headset mic?
I'm
These
fine.
over
No,
here?
no, no, no.
Not
Can
over
I
here?
just use that one?
Absolutely. Fine by me. Okay. I'll leave this here just in case. It should be working now.
You know why? Because I forgot a word. I noticed it earlier. And I don't know why, but this picture doesn't want to go bigger when I click on it. I couldn't get it to work for myself.
Like to stretch it?
Yeah, just so I wanted to stretch it when I get there, but I think it won't work. So I'm just gonna.
I'm sorry, I'm not
That's okay.
a PowerPoint expert.
You know, I used to think I was.
Yeah, me too, actually. Check, check, check. Cool. I'm going to sit over here in the front for a bit, just to get you started, and then I'll run up to the booth.
You're good. I don't care where you sit, honey, but that's good. You want me to smile? Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Kara Krompotich. I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Information. I'm very glad to welcome you here tonight. We're just going to do a quick check that people's phones are off or on airplane mode. I'd also like to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered today, in which we're going to have the Bertha Bassam lecture. There's been a long history of care and a tradition of care of this land. Today, Mississaugas of the New Credit care for this land, before them Haudenosaunee, who still do care for this land today, and the Huron-Wendat. And that's, they're just sort of the most recent in a very long history of stewarding and caring for this land. There's the Dish with One Spoon covenant agreement that brings us together, and it reminds us that we too today need to take part in thinking about and caring for this place that we're in. So it's an honor to do work here at the University of Toronto. For me, it's been an honor to do research with Anishinaabe and Cree women who make their home just a block away from the University of Toronto, and to come to understand this city and this place through their eyes and their sort of 50-year history in this place. So it has been a real privilege, continues to be a real privilege to work at the University of Toronto in that way. I'd like to invite Vern Ross up to bring us all together today. Vern Ross is a traditional knowledge keeper. He comes from Saskatchewan, from the Cody First Nation. He has been educated at the University of Toronto, which has brought him into being a social worker, a teacher, a mentor, and a community member in Toronto since 1995. He is currently a PhD student at OISE within the curriculum, OISE's program in curriculum, teaching, and the learning department. So Vern, if you'd like to come up, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for welcoming us into this space.
Good evening. My name is Minogishigat Giniwaji Binishi. It means nice day, nice bird. And that's the name that a lot of my community members call me whenever I go back home onto the prairies, which I come from Cody First Nation. I'm going to start off the evening here by doing a smudge, but I'm not going to take the smudge all over. You know, usually at gatherings when whoever's conducting the ceremony will do that, but more or less in a circular setting. So if anybody has any allergies, and you may want to cover up or go outside for a few minutes, because I'm not going to make a big smudge, but enough for us to have a sense and get the feeling of the smudge, where the smudge brings us together. It nurtures us. It puts us in a good, positive frame of mind. I also like to look at it as a way of coming together and working together as well. This is what this smudge does. It allows us to share our stories, because our stories don't only give us our identity, but it nurtures us in so many ways. But it also allows us to heal. Think of those ones that are, especially the children that are in a hospital, young moms that are having a hard time with their little ones. We think of them. And so when I light our smudge bowl, I would like for all of us to think of them as well, because they are our future. I also like to think of all of us here as that we all come from stories. We all are capable of sharing our stories, whether it's going to our communities and attending circles, in ceremonies or writing about the stories. To me, that's reconciliation. Back in our community, reconciliation has always been with us because we are a sharing community and we take care of each other. And we've been doing that for such a long, long time. I come out this way in 1995 to work with my people here in Toronto. I spent 10 years working in hospitals advocating for my people. That's reconciliation. But there were so many stories that I came across and I've heard from the families, from the patients, from the elders, from the grandmothers and the grandfathers, and the children. I wanted to share that as a way of opening this evening here. And so when I light the smudge bowl, I welcome our spirit helpers. Come and listen to us. Come and help us, guide us through this evening. And it's a way of introducing our guest speaker this evening, to allow her to share her story with us. Said that, I want to thank you coming out this evening. And I'll be around if you have any questions or you want to chat with me for a bit, whatever. But let us hear the story of our guest speaker. our friend. Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara, and thank you, Vern, for the story and the healing power. And thank all of you for attending tonight's lecture. Before I turn the podium over to our speaker, I do want to acknowledge that this year, 2017, in which Canada celebrates its 150 years since Confederation, it's more important than ever that we recognize and honor our Indigenous people's right to service. This is the time for building new relationships with our Indigenous communities. The University of Toronto and the Faculty of Information are committed to being part of this collective journey. When the University of Toronto responded to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls, it had a report where first it acknowledged the many ways in which we were complicit in the residential schools, but also it outlined things that we could perhaps do to start a new relationship. One of the numbers of things it did is it outlined some of the hopes of what the Faculty of Information hoped to do, and I just want to outline some of the things. One was we wanted to integrate, we wanted to create a new elective course on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I'm very happy to note that Carol will be teaching that course this winter. And in fact, I understand there'll be quilting, and I so would like to take this course myself. In addition, all members of our faculty, including students, staff, and professors, will be offered the opportunity to undertake cultural awareness training in the coming year. To start, we will be participating in a blanket exercise where participants take on the roles of Indigenous peoples in Canada. This blanket exercise, where blankets represent the land, is designed to educate and increase empathy. It is in the same spirit of Truth and Reconciliation that we've invited Camille Callison as our speaker this evening to deliver the 16th Bertha Bassam Lecture in Librarianship. Camille is here for many reasons, but to help us understand the things we can do in our efforts to decolonize our cultural heritage institutions. I've had the great opportunity just a few weeks ago to hear Camille speak at Library Archives Canada and to have a very interesting dinner last night. And I cannot think of anyone better qualified than to help us on this journey. I'm going to talk a little bit of some of the things that Camille has done, but I'm actually going to let Camille talk about who she is and about her people. Camille holds a BA in Anthropology and an MLIS with a First Nations concentration. She is an Indigenous Service Librarian at the University of Toronto in Manitoba and a liaison librarian in anthropology. She has chaired the Canadian Federation, the CFLA, Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which issued its first recommendations to Canadian libraries earlier this year. And I highly recommend you all read it. It is fascinating reading. And she is co-editor of the book Indigenous Nations of Ownership in Libraries, Archives, and Museums, which was published last year. She is currently working on her PhD in anthropology, and again, she will fill in the rest. You can see why we are so thrilled to have her here with us, and why some of the special guests in the audience tonight are all so keen. I have a list here, but I haven't seen everybody that's supposed to be here. Carol Radford Grant, however, from the City Archives. Daniel Payne, the Head of Instructional Services at OCAD. I don't know if he's here. Desmond Wong, who's the Outreach Liaison Librarian for Indigenous Education, and is the COO of Southern Ontario Library Service, Barbara Frenetta. Ah, there she is. Welcome. And also, of course, the FIA executive, Eve Lung, the president of the Faculty of Information Alumni, and Ashley Graydon, who is the FIA Events Committee Chair, and they were out there diligently giving everybody their name tags when you came in. And of course, we're going to have a reception afterwards where they're there. The slideshow that you've been seeing has, on our monitor, was developed by some of the LIS students for the last Bertha Bassam lecture, which was held in 2015. It was updated this year by Lisa Habib. Thanks to the iSchool Master students and the Informed Student Assistants, Katie Wilson, Anna Stanish, and reference librarian Alina Singh for their work and their research. For those of you who do not know the history of this event or need a reminder, Bertha Bassam was the founding member of the Faculty of Information and Library Service, and director of the library school from 1951 to 1964. That's a long time ago. Yeah, just when I was born, actually. This lecture was, that was a long time ago. This lecture was established in her honor in 1965 by the Faculty of Information Alumni Association. It is delivered on average every 3 to 4 years. It is given by an outstanding individual selected for their ability to offer thought-provoking ideas and reflections on important societal roles of information and cultural professions. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that Camille Callison fits all of this criteria. This afternoon, Camille was kind enough to speak to some of our concurrent Masters of Information and our Master of Museum Studies students on the topic of reconciliation and the revitalization of the profession. This afternoon, I think she also attended a museum studies, so she's just I can't believe her generosity in sharing her stories with us all day. Tonight, she'll be talking to us about delivering information services to Indigenous populations and the role of Canadians and librarians in the process. The title of her lecture is Honoring the Journey on Our Path Towards Reconciliation, a tall tan culture activist story. Please join me in welcoming Camille. How did I get that, right?
Hi, everybody. I just want to say thank you so much for having me here, and I'm honored to be here on the territories of the Mississauga New Credit and Haudenosaunee. Did I say that right? Okay, good. And thank you to Wendy for saying the Tall Tan Nation, right? I always say to people it's tall and tan, but that's actually where I'm from. And I think I have a clicker here. There we go. And I wanted to just mention that I wanted to say thank you very much to the Faculty of Information and the University of Toronto for hosting me here tonight. And thank you to you all, Madhu, which is a thank you in Teltan, and I raise my hands to you. Thank you very much, Madhu, for coming out tonight after I'm sure you've all had a long week already. And I wanted to share with you tonight a little bit about my story, but also to present to you the Truth and Reconciliation Committee's recommendations. And I think that that's important today to be able to change the way that we're working with Indigenous communities. So really the report is about us changing as a profession to be more responsive to Indigenous people and communities in a culturally appropriate manner. So I think that this is really significant today, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the commissioners and their hard work, because I believe that that's why I'm speaking to you tonight, and also too why we are making changes in our profession to be able to adapt to work in a much more respectful way with Indigenous people and communities. So I'm not very good with the adapter, so I think I'm just gonna do this because so I'm from the Teltan Nation, which is located in northern BC, the Yukon. The beak of our nation is in the Yukon, and our tail feathers are actually in Alaska, in Wrangell, Alaska. So we're the people of the Stikine. And the Stikine Grand Canyon is second largest in North America, second only to the Grand Canyon located in Arizona and other states down south. So we're very proud of that. We were very lucky to be able to have much of our territory preserved in parks, and you can see them kind of outlined in green. And that actually was because Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau came and rafted our river in the headwaters of the Stikine. And he went back home and he realized it was a very unique and, of course, the most wonderful, beautiful place in the world. He decided that he would create those parks and supported that to happen. So we were very fortunate due to our location, which is actually a 28 hours drive, kind of give or take, depending on how fast you drive north of Vancouver. It's very remote and isolated, and we didn't have contact until 1836 when Robert Campbell came across as a Hudson's Bay trader. So that was our actual first contact from the east, although we had contact and always had significant trading relationships and intermarriage with Tlingit people, which is why we are a Dene people, but we intermarried with the Tlingit people for peace and for trade relationships, which is very significant. Therefore, we became also button blanket people, and I just want to acknowledge that I was gifted this by my cousin Una Ann. The dress or coat that I'm wearing, which is my clan, which is Tuskia clan. So in the Tahltan Nation, we have two clans, Tuskia clan, which is Crow clan, or we have Wolf clan, which is Chiona clan. We follow our mothers, so we're a matrilineal nation. And every day I wear my bracelet, which is actually Tahltan law, so we are supposed to marry our opposite clan, which was very significant back in the times of living off the land, because we wanted to make sure that we were intermarried with the opposite clan, not only for peace, but also to create those kinship systems and to ensure that people weren't married too closely. So I think that I'm very, very fortunate to have grown up as an outfitter's daughter, who my dad, Dempsey Callison, was an outfitter, and so I was very fortunate to grow up going out into the mountains and packing on horseback. When he finally retired and sold his outfitting territory, he had 55 head of horses, so I was very fortunate to be able to experience that lifestyle. And also, too, to be part of the land and learn our stories from sitting around the campfire and listening to my elders. And in our community, about 80% of our community lives out of our territory. And there is no high school, actually, except for in one community. But most of our community members go out for high school. And it's kind of followed a tradition where people left for residential school, except that residential school, my dad left our territory at 12 years old to go up to residential school in the Yukon. He attended 2 different residential schools, and many of our community members didn't come back. Part of the reason for us being able to, because we're 8 hours actually from a Safeway, so you either have to go north to Whitehorse or down to Smithers or Terrace to be able to actually go to a grocery store. But because of that, our community has retained its culture and honestly lives off the land. Every year we all go back when the salmon's running in the river, and we meet at the confluence of the Tahltan and Stikine River at a place where I'm hoping that it actually shows, which is Tuskia Chokima, and you'll see that on my right, your left. And Tuskia Chokima is actually Raven's home. And so it's a relief that actually the canyon, in the Stikine Canyon, which has been carved and it looks like the wings of a bird, and the top of it, which you can barely see, is called Crow's Chimney. So Tuskia Cho is big crow, so that would be raven, and then Kima means house. So that's really significant because I think that this is our most sacred site. This is where we believe that creation happened, and where our nation was formed. So knowing our history and who we are really informs us today for our present and gives us direction into the future. My grandpa, Robert Kwok, my dad's uncle, he always said to us, we belong to the land. And I really believe that that's very important. We don't own the land, but we belong to our land and to our territory. And I always talk with people about that because I think that where our DNA comes from and who we are as people is very much reflected in the territory, and that's why I wanted to acknowledge the tradition that we're standing on. I've been a guest in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, in the homeland of the Anishinaabe people at the University of Manitoba, which is also the heart of the Red River Métis population. And I think that being there has really informed a lot of the work that we did with the CFLA, FCAB, because of the support that we have in that with Indigenous achievement and people like our president, and having the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation located on the premises. I also need to mention that as Tahltan people, we've never treated and we will never cede or surrender our territory. We have a Tahltan Declaration, which was given to the Crown and to the Queen in 1910. October 18th is Tahltan Day, and the mining that happens in our territory, because we sit on 1/11th of the province of British Columbia, and we are basically called the Golden Triangle in mining. So our community members are employed in mining most of the time, 2 weeks in, 2 weeks out. So it's actually part of how we operate as a community as well, too, that our people are experts in mining and road building. They say that some of the greatest contact actually happened when the Alaska Highway was built, and many of our community members, including my father and many of my relatives, worked on that highway. Later on, because it always has to be upkept, because as we know, in Canada, we'll have a lot of distress from winter road conditions. And I think that part of that in our territory is that we're very fortunate to be able to have the declaration where we've never ceded or surrendered. So that's definitely a sign of pride for our community. Our great chief, Nana Kwok, who's my dad's great-grandfather, was the one who was the lead chief at that time, and all of our tribes signed on to that. We have celebrated 100 years of the 100th anniversary of the Declaration in 2010, and we all went back and celebrated that Declaration, so we're very proud of that. I also need to mention that I spent a lot of my life coming back here to Ontario, because this is where my mother is from, Kay Parker, and she is actually born and raised in Dunnville. She went up to Whitehorse and met and married my dad, and so I would be remiss not to mention that. I'm the proud mother of a 34-year-old son named Matthew, and I have two sisters, Cynthia and Candace, who you see in the picture. I was given my name Esdada, which means that I fly around crazy, like trying to preserve our knowledge and talk about Indigenous matters. When I finished my master's degree and I went back home and I worked for my own community for 3 years, digitizing some of the traditional use studies that had been done and the oral traditions of many elders who have now passed on. And so I actually feel like I'm wearing my late adopted grandma, Liza Zerza, and I'm wearing her moccasins that she made for me today. So I always have to acknowledge that that's who I am, and to be able to give you a little bit of context of my life. I was very influenced to go into librarianship by a librarian named by the name of Jean Joseph, who was a title librarian for Delgamuukw, and she is Wet'suwet'en and Dalek from northern BC, just south of where I'm from. And I actually was going into anthropology, and that's actually what I wanted to do, and she challenged me by saying, if you gather all of those oral histories, what are you going to do with them, and how are you going to preserve them, and how do you provide access to that? So that's been one of the things that motivates me, and we all talk about the things that keep us awake at night, and that's it for me. Because when I worked in communities, one of the things that I noticed was that many of the oral histories that were captured might be in a box someplace, and they weren't organized, and we couldn't use them for education or for language resources. In my community, because of moving away from our community, and I wasn't born there or raised there. My dad was born at a place called Chesley, which is north of Telegraph Creek, which is our main community. And I think because of that, moving for work and other issues, many of our community members don't speak our language. We have less than 20 fluent speakers right now, and there's a huge language recovery going on right now, led by Dr. Julie Thompson, and she has done incredible work with many of our other language holders that have been able to re-influence that. But like I said about Tuskia Chokiman, I'm able to give you the pronunciation and what that means, and within that holds many of our knowledge and our creation stories. For a long time, I would hear people that were non-Tahltan speakers and other people that were living in our territory call it Eagle Rock. And that's not actually the meaning, and it doesn't relay that message of who it is and what it is. So I think that that's really super important for us to do that. And I'm really encouraged that this government is moving towards having Indigenous language legislation. So I believe that our knowledges have unfolded in them, the meanings, and that worldview has to be accessed through our Indigenous languages. So one of the things that I talk about when I'm talking to people is how can libraries, archives, and cultural memory institutions work with Indigenous communities. And one of the biggest things that we can do is to be able to play a central role in preservation of that Indigenous heritage and our languages. And how can we work with that? Even though there might not have been a written word in English, I just explained to you what my bracelet meant, which if I did not explain that to you, you wouldn't understand, but that was our form of literacy, much like our button blankets are, much like wampum belts, much like many other traditional ways of knowing, which is literacy in itself. And so we always had that. And I believe that also, too, that when cultural centers are formed in communities, that it becomes a gathering place for people to be able to know their culture, know their language, and to have education. So I always encourage people to create their own. I think the biggest thing about what we can do in our institutions is to be able to create relationship. I always say I'm like that real estate agent that says location, location, location. Well, working in reconciliation is really about relationship, relationship, relationship with the people that are where your institution is located. So the people here from this territory are the people that you need to work with, and that's part of the reason why we did overarching principles and recommendations to be able to do that. So fast forward, I moved to Manitoba January 1st, 2012. It was the first time I moved out of my own province, and I was welcomed there. And I remember the elders said to me at that time, I have to admit that I really didn't public speak at that time, and I wouldn't. When I would read my report in my community, my sister would often have to grab it and read it for me because I couldn't speak in public. So I just want to preface that with a part that when I moved to Manitoba, I realized that I had a role to play in Indigenous students coming to the library and bringing the library to them. So I did a number of things like having mobile reference at the Indigenous Student House, which is called Megaziagamik, and I had two amazing elders when I first went there, Elder Gary Robson and Elder Florence Painter, who said to me, there's knowledge that you have that you need to talk about in your profession and to be able to present that knowledge because people need to hear it. So it's really because of them that I started to actually present at conferences. I had a little bit before, but I was not comfortable doing it, so I rarely would become part of that. I kind of got, I decided that I would be part of the Manitoba Library Association. They had a call for people to come out, and I kind of got voluntold that I should be involved in that just as a way of getting to know the community. And so I became that, and I ended up at the meeting, and my big thing was that I wanted to start an Indigenous group because the First Nations interest group from BC had been so instrumental, and I was a recipient of the Jean Joseph Scholarship and at the First Nations concentration. And then they needed somebody to become president, and there was no one, and I don't know how I did it, but I said, okay, I will do this. So I became vice president, and then I became president. And at the Ontario Library Association, Sandra Singh, who was going to be coming in as president of Canadian Library Association, and Marie DeYoung organized a meeting. Marie DeYoung was the president at that time. And they said that Canadian Library Association was no longer fiscally viable to continue in its present form. And so they invited all the presidents of the provincial associations, many of the other library leaders of other associations in Canada. And I went with my then vice president, who is now president, Alex Ray-Stefanko, and they talked about trying to form a new federation and how we could move forward. After about a year of meetings where there was, I think, 12 or 13 of us on the that were participating in that, and we decided that we would go with a model that reflected IFLA, so an association of associations model, so that we could work with it like that, and that the members would be from the association. We had our first meeting in June of 2016, and I remember I walked into the meeting after flying in the night before, and one of the first things that Donna Bourne-Tyson and Paul Takala said to me was, we want to have truth and reconciliation as one of our main priorities, in addition to advocacy and copyright. And I thought to myself, that's great, because we had been there the year before. We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report came down, and we had the big march in Ottawa at the same time as CLA. At that time, I was responsible for writing the very first territorial acknowledgement that actually CLA ever did, and that also happened in Manitoba. So I will say that after 10 years of being the moderator for Indigenous library literacy needs in Canada, it was very hard to make movement. We would have a session and this and that, but it's really because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and their work that we were able to really make some headway in Canada. These are the members last February when we delivered the report for Canadian Federation of Library Associations, CFLA, FCAB. I won't try to murder the French on you. And I think one of the things that I felt very good about was that as I was leaving, or as we planned this federation, we said that there would be a Francophone member, but that I asked them if there is, in this time of reconciliation, there needs to be an Indigenous representative as well on the board. And I didn't know that that would actually be me, fast forward. So I ended up finishing my term as Manitoba Library Association president, and then all of a sudden they're like, we need you to stay on the board. So they asked me to be the very first Indigenous representative. They asked for this a committee to take place, and I think I keep on doing that. Sorry about that. So we actually had our very first meeting on September 30th in 2016. And I want to acknowledge the interim board that was very instrumental in having this happen. So we have a number of people on here that were part of that at the very beginning. And it was wholeheartedly adopted by the board, and we had 4 members of the board as liaisons for each of our teams. So they were very involved from the very beginning, and they still are, and very supportive. I have to acknowledge that. And these are the members of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and I'm not sure because we had all of our meetings by conference call, so every place I go, I actually get to meet members face to face. So if there are any of you here, please raise your hand. I want to acknowledge you. No, I don't see anybody here. Okay, good. They probably already heard me speak. So, but these 45 people came from every province and territory across Canada, which in itself was very difficult to be able to pull off in a library committee. We didn't have the Archives Association join us until November, so I did have some people that were representing that, and before we put out the report, we worked with them to make sure that we had the recommendations proper. And I think these people are really the people. I may be the face and presenting this here to you today, but these 45 people are the people who did the heavy lifting and the hard work. And I can never say enough about them because they continually amazed me. And the things that they brought forward were just unbelievable to be able to actually do this in this a short amount of time. One of the things that I talk about is that we worked with libraries of all kinds and cultural memory institutions. We wanted to address what we were doing and to put forward to the incoming board. So because we were the interim board, we wanted to make recommendations that the elected board the next year would be able to implement and adopt. So that's kind of what we did, and I think that You know, at the time, it was just very, it was a very intense time of 3 months of hard work for all of these people to be able to come up with some of the recommendations. And so we had a charter, and we existed to promote initiatives in all types of libraries to advance reconciliation and to promote collaboration. So those were our really responsibilities that came forward, which was 4 things. We needed to work with existing committees to highlight best practices, because too often in libraries we work in silos and we're recreating the wheel rather than sharing our knowledge and being able to do that. And so we wanted to be able to create something where people could see what others were doing. We wanted to engage, and this is still something that is ongoing, but like a national association of people working in cultural memory. There was an attempt at forming the National Aboriginal Library Association by the National Reading Campaign. And one of the things that we said then was that it needed to be Indigenous. When I refer to Indigenous, I'm talking about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada. And that also, too, because of the holistic view, an Indigenous view of our knowledge and heritage, it's not just in mainstream libraries and archives and museums. We don't separate it out. It's holistic in its nature, and it needs to be connected. So how then do we do with knowledge and language together? So we wanted to look at reviewing best practices across the country and recommend a long-term structure and standing committee to the board. So those were our things. Because I was chairing this, and I have to say that it was a little bit intimidating, but one of the things that I did through working with our now elders, who I gave them tobacco in a traditional manner, and I talked with our elders at University of Manitoba because I wanted to be accountable and to do it in a traditional way or an Indigenous way. And so Elder Norman Mead, who is Métis and Anishinaabe, I believe, and Elder Marlene Kakayas, who is Cree, as a Cree woman, and they're our elders at the University of Manitoba, and we decided to go with a medicine wheel team and to put these 4 practices and to separate them out into the medicine wheel. And so we created that. We adapted the medicine wheel. That was because I'm a guest in Treaty 1 territory, and those are the elders that I answer to. We use the model there. So across the country, there's many different colors for medicine wheel. I found out when I was in Nova Scotia that the Mi'kmaq actually switched the colors. So it's very interesting. I'm not a medicine wheel. I don't come from a community that is medicine wheel. We're about the feast system, and we more look at our knowledge like a spider web. But the medicine wheel is important because it really helps non-Indigenous people to visualize an Indigenous worldview. And so it's crucial for people to be able to actually be able to conceptualize that. And so we did that. And so the white was really looking at the TRC calls to actions and saying what we've done and a gap analysis. The black was looking at best practices, what's happening across the country. And the yellow was looking at relationships and how can we create those relationships across Canada. In BC alone, there's 33 distinct Indigenous languages, and we have 197 bands. So even within that one province, how are you going to get everybody to be able to work together? And so it's about creating those relationships again. And I think that that's really the thing that we wanted to be able to do. And then red was really future-facing. So we wanted to look at how can we decolonize what we're doing in libraries and to protect Indigenous knowledge, and how do we look at outreach and service in a new way that we're being culturally responsible and responsive to people. These are the teams that were formed. We had Indigenous and non-Indigenous leaders on every team, and we had a board member on every team, and then people were able to sign up for the team that they felt that they best suited to be able to work on it. And amazingly, it ended up very balanced. I'm sure you've all read all the 83 pages of the report, right? And you can recite it to me, but because it came so wieldy with all these people doing all this research and pulling things together, we decided that we would go with 10 overarching recommendations. And the reason why we did that is that people can remember the 10 overarching recommendations a little bit easier than all of the other components. And so we have more granular recommendations on each of these topics within the report. And it's really a snapshot of where we are at the present moment. It's a foundation to be built upon, and all the databases are living so that they can be updated on a regular basis. And I think that one of the first recommendation that we made is that we wanted to have a standing committee on Indigenous matters. And because we were modeling after IFLA, we were fortunate enough to have IFLA Indigenous Matters section that was formed. Well, we actually had a special interest group, and then we had a few other things, but we actually got established as a section last fall. And so we wanted to use that same terminology, not Indigenous people matter, but also too, because we didn't want to talk about issues. We wanted to talk about matters that are important to Indigenous communities. So we recommended that happen, and we are actively working within the Indigenous Matters Committee right now, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other thing was that we wanted to support, there was a position statements, we had a number of position statements at CFLA, FCAB, that we adopted at CFLA, and one of them was the best practices, which actually were the same best practices that were integrated into the bid to bring the Truth and Reconciliation archives to the University of Manitoba to create the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. So the best practices included protecting and preserving Indigenous knowledge in a culturally respectful and sensitive manner, providing a warm and welcoming place, seeking direction from communities, again, the relationship on how to deal with their matters, respecting that copyright that's in our knowledge and languages, and to provide access and opportunities for training and employment. And I think it's really important. This is one thing that I noticed when I was going through school, is that people talk about educating Indigenous people, but we need to also have jobs for them when they're finished that education. The third recommendation was that we wanted to encourage our institutions in library archives, cultural memory institutions, to implement the 94 calls to actions. And what we did with that is we identified the ones that have a direct impact on libraries, because I'm sure you all noted that libraries weren't noted in the calls to action, but that we have a crucial job of working with other people to support those. So what can we prioritize to do right away? And this was done by the white team. There was things that were prioritized to happen that could happen immediately, and other things that were secondary that might take a longer time to be able to do. So those are available. And they also put in some best practices as well. So you could see, I think they called it good practice, and you could see what that was. We wanted to support as well accessibility and the Marrakesh Treaty that IFLA had proposed and the UN has adopted. And that is to create equitable library services for all people. And I think that's important that we did that. And I think the next thing that we talked about was decolonizing access and classification by addressing structural biases that are in existing schemes of knowledge and information retrieval. So we want to integrate Indigenous epistemologies, and part of that is looking at cataloging, access, a number of different examples that have happened around the country to really be able to do that. One of our first Indigenous classification systems was actually done by Brian Deere, a Mohawk librarian who worked for what is now known as AFN, and he integrated that. And I worked at the Wiwa Library at the First Nations House of Learning at UBC during my both my undergrad and my master's, and they implemented that, but they adapted it, and then we've adapted it a couple times since, and that Indigenous classification scheme now is being used at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation alongside our library system. So it's actually encouraging to watch that happen. There's been a number of working groups on subject headings to be able to create that, and I think that that work is also in those chapters, so you can look at all of that. Well, I know it's in there. And so the other thing was to decolonize libraries in space through a number of different ways, like signage, like wayfaring signs being in English and in Blackfoot. I was saying a great example at Mount Royal University now that's done that in their new library. There's many people that have done that. If they have art in their collection, creating special collections. At the University of Manitoba, we have an Indigenous health collection that's over 20 years old, and we have Mazini Biget, the first Indigenous graphic novel collection, and I think those kind of things, and there's examples in every library that we go to. Of course, I have to say about University of Manitoba because that's where I get paid from, and but I think that there's many, many things like that. I mean, we have things like the Weewa Library, we have amazing work that's being done here at the University of Toronto as well. And also, too, having geographic specific territories. So there's an appendix on how you go about doing that in public programming. How do we bring in our elders and other traditional teachers? They're really, I always say this, there are PhDs and they need to be treated appropriately and recognizing cultural norms. So, for example, in Manitoba, when I moved there, I didn't realize that they only tell their stories when the snow is on the ground. In BC, we tell our stories, or in my nation anyway, we tell our stories when people are gathered together and in the feast hall, but it's different in every community, and that's why you have to have that relationship with the local community. And to bring those people into our library, and when I was working with, when I started to work at the University of Manitoba, one of the things that I talked about at IFLA when I gave a presentation was how we bring the library to the community by bringing a mobile reference to places where our Indigenous students are and then welcoming them back into the library. So I end up working with many of the Indigenous students on Tuesdays and Wednesdays during the fall and winter term, and I always I might be the gateway, but I know who the librarian is that's in charge of biology or chemistry or English, and then I direct them towards them. But it's providing that warm and welcoming place to be able to do that. We talked about training. So number 7 has actually 3 components in it, and one of them is including Indigenous epistemologies in the library and archives profession in our training. The other thing is to have culturally appropriate pedagogy, but also recruitment practices. And then how do we do cross-cultural training as a profession? And some of that actually will be addressed a little bit later, but also how do we support that cross-cultural training in our libraries, archives, and cultural memory institutions? So we'll give some examples. The other thing is talking about Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge, we love sharing our knowledge, first of all, so we love to be able to share that, but it needs to be done in a culturally appropriate manner, respecting our cultural norms, and we need to acknowledge that that's Indigenous knowledge. And so we called upon Library and Archives Canada to fully implement WIPO on the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore, and to fully implement UNDRIP. And I think that one of the things that I talk about with people is that it's about accessing things in a culturally appropriate manner. So there are some things that women can't see or to be part of on their moon, and it's not because we're sexist in any way, because we honor our women. They are life givers, and we know that they have more power on that time. And I just think that that's something that has been a little bit of a misconception, but it is really about honoring. There's also certain information that are part of a secret society. I, as a Tahltan woman, can't tell a Chiona or a Wolf story. That has to be done by them. I can't sing a song that's owned by another family. So even within my own community, I have to acknowledge and respect those cultural, to respect in a culturally appropriate way that knowledge. When I moved to Manitoba, I wasn't used to having to wear a long dress, but I started to do that because I respect where I am, much like we do when we go into a mosque. We'll take off our shoes, and some places you need to have a headdress as a woman. There's many different things that you need to do with different cultures, and it's about doing that. But also, too, acknowledging that Indigenous people have always owned their own knowledge, and that we need to respect that in a good way. So some quick facts about that is that I talk about Indigenous knowledge. I know that the terminology, legal definition is traditional knowledge, but our knowledge is dynamic. And it still continues to this day. We see it in blogs, we see it in theater, we see it in songs, hip-hop songs, whatever. We see a number of different things. And I think that we need to acknowledge that dynamicy of that, and that it has been sustained and transformed and continues to remain dynamic. So one of the things that we talk about often, and because I come from the discipline of anthropology, I will say it, is that anthropologists went and collected stories. We're grateful that they collected those stories and we're able to record them, but they legally then own that copyright because they wrote them down where we know them, and because we come from that culture of orality. And so I think that one of those things is to be able to address some of those needs. And we also need to be able to acknowledge who the traditional or the owners of that knowledge is, right? So I think that that's really important, and we have been working on trying to change some of that within the Canadian context. The other thing is that we created these living documents that highlighted best practices, and so there's actually 4 databases. So if you go to the report and you can look at those, but they're actually best practices both in Canada and around the world, looking at different things. And we ask that they be updated, because I think the most irritating thing for me is looking at a website that's 5 years out of date, and you know that other things have happened, but you can't find that information. So we didn't want to be one of those types of websites. And so we also asked that we wanted to support the building of relationships and development of an Indigenous association dedicated to cultural memory, preservation, and languages. So working within library, archives, museums, language preservation, a number of different things, and to support the National Aboriginal Librarian Association in their aim to have more libraries on First Nations communities. We do have a few of the disclaimers, and I'll explain a little bit about that, is that we wanted to talk about this being a foundation to be built upon. And so one of the things that we're going to move ahead with in Indigenous Matters Committee is working on Indigenous health, having that, creating that in a portal for that, creating things that are legal advice and things to do with Indigenous people and the Glad You decision kind of thing. We also didn't consult with Indigenous communities. And it was about a lack of time, but it wasn't just about that. It was about the fact that we were here, this report was designed to be able to change the profession, not to change our communities, right? So it wasn't really about that, but the principles were looked at by many Indigenous professionals, and I had a few of the people that are mentors to me to be able to look at that, including Jean Joseph, and I think some of those things were really important to be able to look at it. So there was a number of draft recommendations that went out for people to review before we presented them on February 1st. There was a lack of input from the Canadian archival community because they have their own process and a standing committee on that with the TRC task force. And they have their own process because they're responding to a particular call to action. And it's a 2-year process. So many of our members actually sit on both committees. And we integrated them into the Indigenous Matters Committee now in the center. So we actually are formed the Indigenous Matters Committee, and we've spent a bit of time on the foundation, plus waiting for people to be nominated. But I think one of the keys to this is that in the center we have Indigenous knowledge and language, because everything really revolves around that. And so that actually is a specific team, and we have two new team leaders, Erica Nunez-Reed, who's doing she's chairing the task force, TRC task force for the archives, and Jerry Lawson, who works in indigenization, a program from UBC that is indigenizing Indigenous language within the province and works with communities, training them. I think that one of the things that moving forward is that it's really easy to tell people what they can do. I mean, I think we can all make recommendations to anybody about what they should do, but it's much harder to implement them. So it's a much larger team than it was with more committee members. Some of the things that have happened since then is that when we released when we finally got the report online, it took a couple months to be able to edit it for the web and get all the spreadsheets and everything ready. And then on June 1st, which was Aboriginal Peoples Day, now Indigenous Peoples Day, and I'm hoping that this works. I did ask, and I don't know why it's not working, but we'll go forward with that. There is an Indigenous Resources Hub that hosts the Truth and Reconciliation report as one of the things. It also has been endorsed across the country by many, or all of the library associations that are part of CFLA, FCAB, but many libraries, including Toronto Public. And I think that many, many public libraries and also 2 universities and university library caucuses. So that's been exciting. And this summer, we had, and I'm hoping that she's here. Alex Crothers, are you here? Ah, there you are. See, I've never met her either. And Melanie Ribaud, there you are. Okay. And so we had this dynamic team from Toronto Public Library and Edmonton Public Library and the University of Alberta, who had developed an Indigenous Canada MOOC. And we worked with them to create that and put together a fact sheet for people to be able to deliver that from their libraries. I think that it's really good for cross-cultural training for our professional staff, so you can take it for free or you can get a certificate. We saw the numbers the other day, and it's quite astounding that there's over 1,500 people in Canada taking that course right now, so that's really amazing. But part of it is because I noticed that the librarian that you were talking about the year I was born, he retired, so I don't know if that was a sign, but when I was young, in the 60s and 70s, we didn't have very much on Indigenous people that was taught in our schools, and that's one of the things that we need to rectify and change, is that we want to be able to have people educated about Indigenous history and about our role within Canada to even create Canada and to create our provinces and to win the war in 1812. Much of that is Indigenous contributions to this great country that we live in, and that needs to be acknowledged, and people need to know about it before they can acknowledge that. So that's really key. The other thing that we're doing to move forward is reconciliation dialogues, which was actually the impetus of the Canadian Council for UNESCO. And so we're working with them and Library and Archives Canada, the National Film Board, and the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. And it's to host these reconciliation dialogues at libraries or other institutions where they have space and are willing to do that, to bring in a film from the National Film Board, and then to create a dialogue afterwards about that film with local Indigenous elders or traditional teachers. We are participating somewhat in the, I'm a member on the Standing Committee for Indigenous Matters at IFLA, but we also have been sharing our knowledge with them and vice versa, so that's been very interesting. And we do have, of course, we have a Facebook site that was created by Jessie Lawyer, one of our librarians, Indigenous librarians, who's Korean Métis from Alberta. And we quite often talk with each other on that to be able to share what we've been doing. So there are a number of things happening in libraries in Canada with regard to Indigenous matters within the country. Okay, one of the links actually worked. So I think one of the big things is that I wanted to make sure that you knew where the Indigenous Resources Hub was and where the report was. And I really like to do this for some strange reason, but I love scrolling down and showing all the associations and endorsements of the Truth and Reconciliation report. And I think that that's really important, that people are endorsing it. It doesn't mean that overnight you need to do that, but that you're starting to work towards doing that and that you want to be part of the movement. And I say to people, we need our allies. At the beginning, people wanted to put on just Indigenous people onto this, and I said, no, reconciliation is about Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people working together. And so I ask you to walk beside me in that path towards reconciliation. I don't want you to walk in front of me or to be able to be the leader in that unless we need help on that path to help each other. But I won't ask you to walk behind me either. And I ask you to walk beside me on our journey towards reconciliation. And I really feel very encouraged today to stand before you and see so many beautiful faces of, to me, being a librarian for an Indigenous person was a revolutionary act, but I'm sure that it was for almost everybody in this room, because we are the change makers and we can change our great country here in Canada and walk towards making a new Canada on the path towards reconciliation. So I thank you very much, Madhu. I raise my hands to you and thank you for your time and attention, and I won't hold you back from the wine. There we go.
Ever a phrase to get this group, it is
that idea of revolutionary librarians. These are your people. As I understand it, we will have, there were supposed to be 2 microphones set up, 1 on each side. But if people feel comfortable, that is yours, yes. Please raise your hand if you've got questions. They're at the front, I'm sorry. Here. We'll move them. If people have questions for Camille, please feel free to come. We'll have a mic on each side, and we'll just go back and forth between sides and take questions.
So I'm hoping, I've actually presented across the country on this topic, and I think this is the last time that I will present on this topic, hopefully ever, because I feel like we've saturated the market. So if you really have a question, you should ask it now.
Camille, thank you so much for your leadership, but I just want to say that your phraseology is perfect on walking beside. Good leaders and good leadership is put beside good followership. And I think that that's a lesson for all of us to learn, and it's language we should all install in our vocabulary about walking beside. So we're not owning an issue, but we're working together, and I think that's what reconciliation is all about. So thank you for giving us that bridge.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and I just want to acknowledge and appreciate your support as well for Indigenous people in librarianship. I benefited from that, and I really appreciate that. I think that there's been so many people in our community that have been so supportive, but I think also, too, we needed this kickstart from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to actually put this into action. So I thank you very much for your comment, and I appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's enlightening to me. What I was wondering is if there's any movement in your groups that you're mentioning towards supporting the actual building of libraries, public libraries on native reserves, or whatever policies have been developed around that.
So the National Reading Campaign actually was a recipient of some grant funding from the TD Bank. And that's how they created that business plan for National Aboriginal Librarian Association. And they put in a proposal to the government and that to be able to create more libraries in communities. Part of the problem is that, well, number one, it wasn't funded. Number two, they told them at Indian and Northern Affairs to go to Heritage. So it's kind of like, you know, when you were a teenager and your mom told you to go ask dad, and then the dad told you to go ask mom. It's kind of like that right now. That's what I see anyway happening. I know that that movement has been endorsed by AFN. I think that part of the reason why I see a National Association of Indigenous People working in this field is to be able to be that voice and to work together. So we've had a few meetings. We had a meeting at the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries and Museums. We had a meeting last week at Library and Archives Canada to, that's kind of what the Yellow Team is tasked to be able to do, is to create those relationships. And Guy Bertha, our librarian Archivist of Canada, has given his support and many amazing staff members to help us work in each of these teams. So that's been really exciting. I think that part of the problem is that we talk about libraries on reserve, but it really shouldn't be libraries, because it should be more of a cultural center, and that should be in their language. And even the Indigenous Materials Classification system, it's a framework, but it's supposed to actually have their language embedded into it so that they can do that. Because what happens with cultural centers is that even libraries and communities or archives, it often becomes the place, a location where our tangible and intangible knowledge is located. So you might have a painting from your cousin, you might have oral histories, so there's your archive, the digitization, the oral histories, you might have moccasins that Grandma Lizzie made or whatever, right? Like, I think that those are important as well as the books, and it usually becomes a center where language is taught. So it really has to be something that's a little bit different and really Indigenous to be in the community, and because it becomes that anyway. And I think that that's part of the drawback, is that as librarians will say to each other, well, we want to have a library on reserve, which is really important, but often they won't. It's that same dilemma as the free little libraries, is like, or little free libraries, whatever they're called, those houses, is that who's going to be there to curate it? So we have to have the staff to be trained to be able to do it. I never wanted to leave my community again, but I had to for work, and I think that that's one of the things, is that nobody wants to leave their community. The real culture, the people who are keeping the culture at home, who are our elders and our traditional teachers, they're not going to leave to get that training. And so I always say that as librarians and archivists and people working in cultural memory and museum, we're the keepers of that culture, but only as the tools go. We don't actually hold that knowledge. And so to get people to leave their communities for 6 years to go to school is amazing, if that can happen, but it doesn't happen very often, and it's not often the people who are actually doing the actual cultural work, right? So some of that is the difficulty that we face, is number one, not having the trained staff. When that trained staff is finished their education, where's the funding to be able to do that? When I worked in my community before the fall in 2008, I was able to get funding to do the digitization by working in heritage and doing traditional use studies, and to be able to do that. So it wasn't something that was an actual library. Maybe we had a reference library and a reading room for the community, but it's hard to find the funding to be able to do that. And where do you go to do that? Library and Archives Canada doesn't give funding to libraries. We know that. Where are we going to be able to find that? We don't have IMLS funding like they do in the United States, where they've created a number of tribal libraries. We don't have that ability to do that in Canada. So something has to change for us to be able to do that. And I think that we can only do that by create that change by having more advocacy. I know that in many communities, they've been able to access different things. So for example, in Manitoba, they accessed the Dolly Parton Fund, and I just lost the name of it, I'm sorry. I know that there's different people like working with communities that will donate books and do this kind of thing, but it's not anything that's really structured or a formal thing to be able to do, and maybe that's part of what we can do, is to start to fundraise and work with the government on that, on having that. I think that part of the issue has been bringing people together. And I have to be honest, as an Indigenous librarian, there's a lot of things that you face that non-Indigenous librarians are not going to be facing, because you have so much community work to do. You're doing a much different job than other librarians are, because you're working with the community and developing those relationships. And none of that is actually recognized in your performance review or in anything like that. So there has to be different things that are happening within communities or within libraries as well, to create that support for Indigenous professionals. So I think there's 6 here in Ontario. I think 6 First Nations libraries on reserve, but many of them, yes, but many of them have are actually more like cultural centers than what we would say a traditional library is. Yeah, so I think that is something that we really need to push, and I believe that that in this province you have so many more people than some of the other smaller population provinces, like for example Manitoba or even the territories, so that you're able to hopefully advocate for that change. I know that OLA has done great work with the First Nations Read program. They've done a lot of different things that have been there to advocate for Indigenous people and communities, but there's so much more that can be done. And I think that we've really kind of just seen the tip of the iceberg in things that we can do as cultural memory professionals working in communities. So thank you very much for your question. I don't have the answer to that. We don't have any funding, obviously, at CFLA, FCAB. We're all volunteers, and every one of those people are also volunteers that worked on that, so there's no funding to access there. But I think that has to be something that we need to advocate for at the national level, the federal level, because First Nations communities are under federal legislation, and that's always been a big thing too. That's like the go ask your mom or your dad, go ask the feds or go ask the province, right? So where does that fall underneath? Because libraries generally have been provincial, not federal. So there's lots of issues to be able to be dealt with. I don't have the answers to them, but I'm hoping that with this great hive mind that we have here, that maybe we can find those answers with each other, working together.
We have time for one more question. Does anyone?
Camille, have you seen the First Nations Libraries Needs Assessment that was released by the provincial government last week?
Is that here in Ontario?
Yes.
Okay, no, I haven't seen that, but I would love to be able to. Yes, I would love to be able to see that.
Recommendations around money and relationships, I think.
Oh, wow, that's exciting.
CFLA and
Oh, that's great. And I think, and we have some members here in the room that are going to be on our Indigenous Matters Committee. And so now that we have our last nominations are in actually this last week, we should be able to start to move forward. So that would be great. And I'd love to share that with the rest of the group to start working towards that. I think part of that is us starting to share that information with each other and to create that kind of synergy between our provincial associations so that we can all work together in a way nationally to move forward within reconciliation. So thank you very much, and I look forward to that email. Thank you very much. I also, I'm just going to show this while we mingle a little bit so you can see a little taste of what our chief and council did. Oh, is he? Okay, we can do that then.
Oh, miigwech, a big miigwech. I want to thank you for sharing your story, but also to drawing out some of the themes in reconciliation, where relationship is such a huge, comes with responsibility, and also the respect, and for the land that we are on. I really appreciate that as for drawing some of those themes out this evening here, but also to remind us that that walking side by side is so important, that there's no hierarchy there, you know, that we do this all together, and that we do it with kindness, and do it with the utmost respect. So having said that, I also look forward to actually walking side by side with yous. Because if you see me out there, you know, come up and say hi. You know, don't be shy. You know, because I meet so many people out there, and so if I forget your name, whatever, you know, just shout it out. You know, because that's what we do here at on campus here. We are moving forward, and it's not easy, but we're getting there. And so I just want to say, miigwech, you all have a safe journey home. And once again, thank miigwech Camille for spending time with us. So miigwech, thank you.
Going to give you a little taste of our celebration. You can hear, I always tell people because I'm of mixed heritage that I'm Tahltan Light, but this is actually back home when we celebrated our 100th anniversary. And as you're leaving, you can just take a little look at what's going on. Hopefully this is big screen here. You can actually look at it on YouTube. I don't know why it's not working, actually. I don't know. I don't actually know why it's not working. So maybe you can just look at it on YouTube because it's not coming up.
Or come up here, it's beautiful here.
You can come up and look at the thing in here.
That's right.
Oh, thank you. It's actually, I mean, I actually was really looking forward to being done, to be honest with you, because I've traveled